Welcome to Thrive and Shine HR, a podcast and video series dedicated to helping us overcome the limiting beliefs, self-doubt, and imposter syndrome that so many of us HR professionals face. Here are your hosts with over 45 years experience in HR and certified life coaches, Jen and Catherine. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to episode 50 of Thrive and Shine HR. Woohoo! I actually went into my closet this morning hoping I could find some confetti. We had some old popper confetti things, and I was digging and digging and digging. I thought that would be kind of fun to celebrate 50. And with this also being my 50th year, if you're kind of new to the podcast, you know that I turned 50 this last year. So being that this is the 50th episode, it felt celebratory this morning. So rather than the confetti, you get me. And I'm going to try to bring it today in terms of energy, in terms of light, in terms of all the things I think we need a little bit more of in this world, which is what I'm wanting to really give out with this celebration episode today. So episode 50 is going to be about reflection. It's going to be about, love of what Catherine and I started and what we've built, and really just a clear foundation on where we are and where I see this podcast going into the future, and really excited for it. So let's jump in, shall we? So I am really a firm believer, especially over the past few years. If you don't know my story, why don't I start there with it being my 50th year? Why don't we start a little bit with me and what really inspired me to get to where I am today. So I am somebody that is a firm believer that what goes around, what we put into this life of ours, is what we get back. And this is not something that I really clearly wrap my head around until about a couple of years ago, where I was like, oh my gosh, what you give is what you get. And as much as I was living my entire life basically playing a victim card in a lot of ways, right? Having a lot of excuses of why this was not my fault, and this was theirs fault, and this was, all of these different reasons and excuses for why I was where I was in my life, but not a ton of true accountability around my part and my role in my place in my life. And that's what really has led me on the journey that I've been on today. And one of the things that has become really clear to me over the past year or so is how much our early life plays a huge factor in where we struggle showing up the way we most want to today. So for me, if you've heard this story before on the podcast, I apologize, but for me, one of my biggest traumas that I've ever experienced in my life was when I was about 3.5 years old, and my father was taken away in an ambulance. And he at that time was a very, very heavy drinker. And he had a huge relapse, and to the point where my mom and my brother had to break down a door and had to get him help. And if you're listening, Dad, I love you so much, because his story is one that is my greatest inspiration in my life. But hang in there. So basically, as a 3.5-year-old, I saw my daddy taken away in an ambulance, and it forever, I think, has left an imprint in me. And I think all of us have an imprint somewhere that has impacted us greatly. And that's one of the things I think when I wanted to start the podcast Thrive and Shine HR, one of the things I really wanted to be able to do is get raw and real about who we are, right? We talk so much about externally what's going on in the HR world and the laws and the policies and, oh my goodness, everything in the political world, don't get us started. But we don't talk a whole lot about ourselves. right? And that's hard to do, especially in the lives we live and the chaos of the roles that we have, and trying to balance everything with personal and professional. And it can be really hard to like check in with ourselves, like deeply check in. And so Catherine and I, when we got together, we recognized that big time and said right from the beginning that we wanted to create something that was going to be about checking in, that was going to be about making a difference in those who are showing up each and every day, trying their best, but continuing to hit the same obstacles, continuing to hit the same roadblocks over and over and over again. So getting back to my greatest trauma, right, and what really brought us to want to create the podcast, my greatest trauma is around abandonment and feeling rejected or isolated or all of that. So I think every one of us have something that has been a huge trigger within us. That's where when we say, oh, I feel like an imposter or imposter syndrome, I don't feel like myself, or I don't feel comfortable. Many times it is those deep triggers within us that is ultimately creating whatever fears, anxieties, worries, doubts, whatever it is that's keeping us from truly being able to be authentic and genuine just as we are. That right there is where it gets to some of the biggest things that I think each and every one of us need to kind of work through, need to kind of figure out. And so that is really kind of led us to the why for the podcast. So within this episode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share different stories of my own personal history. Excuse me. Getting a sippy of water. Sharing own stories of my own personal history that also then tie into the podcast. And so what I wanted to do with that first story of my greatest trauma is talk about that ultimately when it comes to my biggest fears, my biggest, the whatever it is, that scary cliff that, I might be standing on in my own life, that ultimately my greatest fear has to do with being felt abandoned and alone. And for a lot of other people, it has to do with failure, right? The putting ourselves out there and getting rejected. And I definitely have that as well. And for other people, it's a lot of this people-pleasing aspect of ourselves, that we really get caught into this loop where we feel like we're constantly trying to give on to others in a way that doesn't ultimately deep down feel genuine or authentic to the person that we are. And so that's where it could lead to resentments, and it could lead to hostilities or harsh judgments and opinions about others, where we feel like we're being manipulated, but ultimately are we allowing it based on our need to please our need to give others what we feel like they need to be happy so we can be happy, right? And so anyway, I'm kind of going all over the place. I kind of knew that was going to happen today. I was like, okay, here's the thing. I didn't have a ton of time to prep. My husband and I went skiing yesterday. Such a gorgeous day here in Southern Oregon. We've got that late February, early March, just gorgeous, gorgeous weather. So it didn't give me as much prep time with the episode, but that's okay because I have so much within me content-wise of what I want to get to. So I think we're going to be just fine. All right, so now we're to a point where we can kind of see, as I've kind of gone through my journey in my life, it's really been about uncovering more and more about myself that has hindered me from showing up as the person I most want to be, right? That person that doesn't need to feel like an imposter, the person that doesn't need to feel like I could need to put on a mask ever, right? I am just going to put this out there. Either you embrace it or you don't. We can work it out. My intentions are not to hurt and destroy, but they're just to try to be genuine to who I am. That is the journey of a lifetime, my friends, because we have all spent our entire entire lives, I know I did, my first 48, 49 years of my life, spend our entire lives believing, based on our programming and our parents and our institutions and our churches and everything, that basically kind of gave us this mold of who they thought we should be, right? You got to act this way and be this way, and don't do this, and make sure you do that. And all of those things are good and well, right? Like when we talk about the importance of coaching and mentoring and parenting and modeling, all of those things are good and well. But ultimately, when it comes at the sacrifice of an individual losing a sense of self because of the need to please others in a way that doesn't feel good or feel aligned with ourselves, that's where it gets tricky. That's where it really starts to kind of get interesting in terms of like who we really are, who is our identity really. And as HR, I think that's a tricky thing to identify, and I think part of why I felt so compelled to want to start this podcast and want to bring that light out into the world around how complicated it could be to be able to stay aligned with what resonates most clearly and most most grounded way, and being able to make sure that we are serving others in the way that we signed up for, right? Serving our employees and also serving the organization. So having this podcast matters really greatly, because it comes down to, are we checking in with ourselves? Are we doing the quote unquote work, right? You can call it what you want, but really it's, are we doing the gut checking around what might be showing up within ourselves that's causing us to have whatever emotional reaction we might be having, maybe causing us to push away, isolate. So all of these questions, I think, are really the importance of what I think this podcast is come to. And so getting back to my trauma. So, where I think my journey has taken me in my life over the past few years is uncovering the deepest part of myself that did cause me to put on the mask, that did cause me to be a self-proclaimed and proud chameleon for my first 24 years in my career life, right? Like, there is something to be said about how I perpetuated my own chameleonness, right? My own mask wearing, my own imposter as I continued throughout my career, because I wasn't truly checking in with myself around what it was really that was causing me the anxieties, the fears, and the doubts, or whatever that might be coming up for me, that was keeping me actually from speaking up, standing up, shouting, whatever I needed to do, so then that felt truly authentic and aligned. And so understanding those is actually where we go in the podcast. And so what I wanted to do is go down memory road today. So we're already 15 minutes in the episode, and I'm like, okay, everybody, let's get started. But before we really dig into the episode, I'm going to take another quick sip of my water, because I am very parched today for some reason. I think nervous. You know how whenever you're going to be going to a party and you know that there's going to be people there and they're going to be celebrating you, it's your birthday, and everybody's going to be looking at you, and yet deep down there's so much excitement, there's so much like, and also the nerves, right? The fear, what if I say something stupid? What if this person, is upset with me about this thing that I said 2 weeks ago? Our heads start just spinning out of control. And so I think that, in terms of why we are here together, I think is really about being able to kind of slow ourselves down from the spin every once in a while so that we can basically be able to say to one another, I see you. I see you. And I know that you see me. And deep down, we're in this together. We are absolutely 100% in this together. So when it comes to being able to share topics that really matter, Catherine and I, when we decided to come together for this podcast, and if you haven't heard that story, make sure you listen. I think it was 1 or 2 episodes previously where I shared the introduction of how Catherine and I got together. But basically, when we finally got to the point where we were ready to launch, we picked a logo, we picked a name, we were like all in on the bio, who we are. We went a couple weeks, which, you know what, in retrospect, thank you so much, Catherine, for taking the time to be so intentional about the launch of this podcast. Like, again, I'm going to share every single time I talk about you on this podcast. Whenever you want to be a guest, let me know. Okay, so our first episode was so beautiful because it was really about who are we? Who is Catherine? Who is Jen? And what caused us to want to come together and put this together? So the story is beautiful. And from there, we then just really ramped up. I think our second episode, if I recall correctly, hold on, let me grab my little cheat sheet here. Yeah, our second episode, our first episode was who we are, right? Our second episode, because the episodes were lining up with Catherine's Empower Hour. And if you're not familiar with Empower Hour, please check it out. But because our second episode was aligning with Empower Hour, the second episode was all about forgiveness. And Catherine and I, as coaches, we went there. We went there, and we didn't just say that forgiveness is about letting go of the grudge that we have about our boss or our coworker or the owner or previous boss or whatever grudges we have externally. The greatest form you're ever going to give yourself of forgiveness is within yourself. Where are you holding resentments toward yourself? Where are you angry about where you didn't show up and how you coulda, woulda, shoulda? Where are you resentful and bitter and angry or hurt or sad or, where are you holding grudges towards yourself around areas of your life that didn't go the way that you wished that they could go? The missed opportunities that now years later you're still ruminating on. That forgiveness, my friends, is the forgiveness that matters the most. And kicking off this podcast with such a heavy and beautiful topic was a gift. So I highly encourage you to check out episode 2. It just really, really supercharged us for the takeoff that we did within this podcast. Okay, so what I want to do next is I want to share a personal story about forgiveness. And before I do so, I want to pause and I want to do my first ever sponsor chat. So I have been aligned with an organization called Thrive 360 for a couple of years now. I met Christy Lamka, who is the Chief Operating Officer for Thrive 360, a couple of years ago because she and I were doing we were both doing different sorts of educational types of things for individuals when it came to wellness at the workplace. And we ended up getting connected on a Zoom call and started talking about doing a webinar series together. So we ended up doing a 6-part series over the month of May of 2023, so a couple years ago now, and it was called Shattering the Stigma. And in that webinar series, she and I came on for an hour a week, 5 weeks in a row, because May in that month of 2023 had 5 Wednesdays. We came on every single Wednesday in the month of May, and we talked about things that really truly mattered when it comes to mental health and wellness and well-being in the workplace, and how for everybody, it really matters. And for HR professionals, even that much more. And not to say that we're that much more than anyone else. What I mean to say is we have a responsibility in our job description to show up for others. And I think in order to truly be able to show up for others, in order to be able to show up for the suffering and the pain and the confusion and the doubt and all of the emotions that come with others, right? When we're not balanced ourselves, when our house is not fully in order, that imbalance that we bring, I'm like, how do I say this in the most polite and delicate way possible? But when we're out of balance, it's really difficult for us to bring an A game. And I think we all know that, right? But yet we do it all the time, right? I know I did for many, many, many years. And so Christy and I really just went there in that series. And so what I wanted to do today, because, my partnership with Thrive 360 is something that I really, really cherish. And so I want to talk a little bit about who Christy and Thrive 360 is, and then in future episodes we'll go even more about what they do. So Thrive 360 is redefining workplace wellness for modern businesses through a tech-driven platform that delivers custom wellness programs using expert-created content from leading doctors and therapists. Custom is huge. Custom means whatever really matters to me, my parenting, my self-doubt, my anxiety, whatever really resonates with me. This is a program that aligns directly with that for your employees and in your organizations. So I'm going to put a link in the notes for today's broadcast, and I want you to check it out. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about them in future episodes, and I'm going to be sharing some discounts and ways that you can take a look at what they offer in really great ways that will be potential benefit for your organization. Okay, so let's get back to my story when it comes to forgiveness. Okay, it takes a second to get myself to get myself emotionally ready to tell an emotionally charged story. So when I was 16 years old, I got my first ever boyfriend, and his name was Luis. And Luis and I went out for almost 2 years. My very first boyfriend, well, not my very first boyfriend. I think I've shared before I had a 3-weeker when I was in, I think, 8th grade, and I didn't count that, but I should. Justin, I'm sorry. I totally count our 3-week relationship. Anyway, Luis and I went out for almost 2 years, and at the end of our relationship, I was just about ready to graduate high school, and he was just about ready to graduate high school, and I was feeling what do you call it when you were ready to fly from school, like senioritis, and it's something else too, where you're just at that age where you're just like, my hormones, my emotions, everything was out of control. I was lucky enough to be a part of a speech and debate team during the spring part of my senior year, and got to go spend some time down in Sacramento, California. And at that time, Luis and I our relationship was really struggling. There was a lot of emotions. We weren't able to be able to see eye to eye. I was very emotional. He was very emotional. And so when I went on this trip for a speech and debate club down in Sacramento, so at the time I lived in Chico, California, so Chicoans, if you're out there, I love you. But I was at a speech and debate thing in Sacramento, and I met a boy. And this boy just swept me off my feet. And I ended up feeling in a weekend that I had fallen in love with this boy. Here I was, 17 years old, thinking I had fallen in love. I met you a day and a half ago, and came back and broke Luis's heart. And that was May of 1992. And the next month, we both graduated high school. I graduated one day, and the very next day, he was to graduate high school. And on that night, he died in a car accident and crashed into a tree. And it was devastating time in my life. You know, we had just broken up a few weeks earlier. I was still very much in an emotional state where I think there was a lot of confusion and a lot of behaviors and actions that were coming out of me that were just horrible, that were horrible at that time. Alcohol was starting to become a factor in my life at that time with the boy that I met in Sacramento. That was one of the first times that I'd really drank socially with boys before, and boy did that feel good, you know, or in my brain thought it felt really good. And so that's, I think, part of what then came over me, that I thought that I had had this whole new thing. And so anyway, I tell this story, and I tell it, you know, one of my hardest stories that I've ever experienced, because I spent the next nearly 30 years of my life, right, 25 years or so, blaming myself, feeling really, really shameful about my behavior and the fact that that individual, that, you know, my first love, that would have never been his reality had I not chosen to do the things I did and behave in the way I did. And I carried that with me for many years. And it wasn't until about 2.5, 3 years ago, as I started to do a lot of inner work with myself and realized that a lot of the reasons why I struggle when it comes to showing up and being the person I most want to be is because I have a lot of pent up anger towards myself. There was a lot of shame and anger and resentment and hurt and like all of this person's life, right? In my eyes, I believed that I ruined a person's life. And so unpacking that through therapy, through coaching, through everything that I have, you know, worked really hard on in my life, unpacking that has been just tremendously rewarding and also incredibly challenging in so many ways. And I have really gotten to a point where I realized that for myself, it wasn't until I allowed myself the opportunity to forgive myself, to really open myself up to the possibility that forgiveness was possible, that these beliefs that I've carried around about myself, about, you know, how horrible, you know, I was to have done such a thing, that, you know, it you know, I could go on, but that level of forgiveness that I needed for myself because of what I truly saw as this huge failure of me was one of the most liberating and freeing actions that I've ever done. And I have people that I've met who have done different medicine ceremonies, the ayahuasca and the psilocybin. I haven't done any of that yet, but I have a feeling that the liberation that I felt when I really got to a level of self-forgiveness to myself because of what had happened in 1992 is similar, I've heard, because, you know, for people who really have been stuck over many, many, many years because of something that has traumatized them and they hold guilt towards themselves in some way. There's a lot of different ways that we can get at trying to flush that out. And so for me, I think I got really lucky through that combination of therapy and through coaching. And when I was able to flesh that out, when I was able to really recognize the forgiveness within myself is what was needed to start actually being a little bit more comfortable as myself. Because actually what was happening, because I carried so much residual hurt and resentment and shame, and all of these things that I'd been carrying with myself about that, and lots of other things, by the way. This is just one example I'm giving you where I was carrying some things that when I finally learned how to let them go, and when I finally was able to kind of strip away and forgive myself for something that was part of my history and something that I've been able to learn and grow from in exponential ways, the more it's been able to help liberate me, that it doesn't mean that I'm any less accountable or aware of my ridiculous actions and behaviors as a 17-year-old because I've forgiven myself. Actually, quite the opposite. By forgiving myself and by giving myself more and more and more self-care, self-love, self-compassion, by doing that, I've been able to recognize that that 17-year-old girl was terrified. That 17-year-old girl had no good way of expressing herself in a way that was healthy and ultimately was toxic. And because of that, it ended up creating a huge divide in a relationship that she had with a beautiful individual that ultimately created toxicity between the two of them. So the breakup between myself and Louise at that time was absolutely needed for our growth and development. And it's unfortunate that, for whatever reason, God, higher power, Allah, whatever, it's unfortunate that life circumstances pulled him away as it did. And it's fortunate because it's allowed me to learn and grow in a way that I don't think I ever would had I not faced a trauma quite like that, and had I not kind of had to do the work to unpack what needed to be forgiven, what needed to really be moved through in a way now that I can release the chains. And that's where I think the truth of where, the podcast and, Catherine and I, and that magic that we had in that episode number 2 is just amazing. Because having that come to life in the way that it did is truly, it just, I think it was just a beautiful falling together of things in the right time and place as they needed to be. And as I've reflected back over those early relationships in my life, and specifically my first love, the first love who made me laugh like no other, who I saw potential in like no other. He was so smart and such an incredible person. And what I've realized, what happened when I really truly went through the process of self-forgiveness, is I was able to start tapping into the wonder and the beauty of who that individual was, and I could start carrying that torch on in a way that it was meant to be. And as I say that, I get chills, because I think that it's just so beautiful that in our lives, once we really can process through and we can let go of some of the things that have been weighing us down, like in the big way, weighing us down, we start to see that will release a weight that allows us to open ourselves up and become more aware in new ways. And so that was my story about episode 2, about my own forgiveness, and really I think the episode that helped shape what Thrive and Shine has continued to be, and where I think it will continue to be for many, many years to come. So, okay, clear my throat a little bit. Let's jump on to, let me get on to, as we go through the episodes, one of the episodes that I thought was groundbreaking for Catherine and I was on April 16th of 2024, and it's called Say the Right Thing, Knowing When to Coach, to Advise, and When to Direct. Episode 12 was one of those episodes that I really felt so aligned in, because I think as humans, and I think in particular in the HR field, knowing when to advise, knowing when to direct, knowing when to coach, knowing when to listen. Linda, listen. Knowing when to listen is so critical when it comes to being able to truly help support those that we serve. And in this episode, she and I shared stories. She and I really went there in just how beautiful it has been in our experience to know that we have just really done this work, done this true work of recognizing that at the end of the day, when we're going into a complicated, uncomfortable, challenging conversation or dynamic, it's so easy. It's so easy, and we're all, every one of us, yourself included, we are all programmed from a very early age to be very ego-based. Right? So ego-based means we have a tendency, we have a tendency to think of ourselves, to get a bit egoic when it comes to seeing conflict, seeing discord, disagreement with others. Our first go-to is going to be egoic a lot of the time, and it's going to require effort. It's going to require intention. It's going to require awareness to be able to pull back and recognize that that is the natural human state. And it's okay. There's nothing wrong with having an egoic part of ourselves. Where we get ourselves into trouble is if we're not aware of it, and then we go into conversations and communication and collaboration and all of these interactions that we have with others, and now from a place of not really being aware of our own egoic connection to our side, our opinion, our thoughts, it becomes really hard to be open-minded. I'm just going to put it out there. I'm just going to put it out there because it's true. And so what Catherine and I really talked about in this episode on advising and directing and coaching was having the awareness of our role when it comes to that conversation that we're entering in. And how could I best serve in this situation to be able to identify the best possible win-win based on how I'm showing up, and checking in on that, really checking in on that and being aware of that. It's hard. I mean, I can tell you firsthand that right now I'm having a harder time than usual being able to get myself locked into that. Personally, professionally, I think I'm doing okay, even though it's been a complete roller coaster lately as well. Personally, it's been a really hard challenge being able to step out of my own kind of emotional response in a situation, especially when it comes to people close enough to you, right? There ain't nobody able to trigger us better than those we care about the most, right? The people that we really want to see us, right? The people that we really want to hear us are the ones that when there is that misalignment of feeling seen and heard, ooh, boy, that can drive us crazy. That can be really hard to get out of that egoic place and not see that as a personal affront, right? That is something I need to address right now. You need to hear me and see me, and absolutely we need to get on the same page. And I have that within myself. That's like this lioness, this part of myself that is really, really hard for me to calm and tame, especially when I feel as though I'm not being seen or heard, right? So what I'm learning more and more and more is that, when we get into future episodes, but I think now is a good time to do that. So in leaving episode 12, take a listen, or, check it out on YouTube if you want to watch it. It's a great episode if you struggle sometimes trying to figure out, am I advising? Do I need to direct? Do I need to be really direct? Or am I coaching? Am I giving this person the skills that they need, but I'm not the one to tell them what to do? So definitely check it out, but it begins with listening. It begins with listening within ourselves, so then that way we don't have to feel like we're inserting ourselves in something that ultimately is their free will to decide on how they're going to react and respond next. So, okay. All right, so in moving on, I want to get to emotional regulation. So in talking about the personal aspect of what I'm dealing with right now and how difficult it can be to see ourselves clearly, to see how our emotions might be causing us to respond in a way that feels very personal. And when that starts to happen, when we start taking things personally versus really getting curious, really getting to the root of what might be the why of the disconnect or the misalignment, I think that's where I get myself into trouble. And I think that's where many of us get ourselves into trouble, is this challenge we have of really recognizing that we're out of alignment within ourselves, that we are dysregulated in some way, and now we're hurt and we're frustrated and we're angry, and these are the emotions that ultimately, as humans, we feel we're not in control of when they come up within us, right? The physical sensation within our body, the rushing of of our of our body, our heart rate, our skin, we might sweat, all of those things, and so it's so important that we are aware of what's happening and how that's happening. And so Catherine and I, in the episode, let me get to the page here. Stop taking things personally in HR. So in episode 27, Catherine and I, we talked about how difficult it can be in any role in our lives, right? Professionally or personally, how difficult it can be not to take things personally when we are engaging with other individuals, to not feel as though someone's perception of us, someone's opinion of us needs to be something that we need to attach to in some way, that it needs to actually have a positive or negative charge. And wow, if that's not super triggering for a lot of us out there, because I think we many times feel very justified in emotional reactions that we have. I got angry because you, I'm frustrated because you. And ultimately, we got frustrated because we've taken something personally. We've decided to charge something and to see someone's opinion of us, or someone's expectation of us, or someone's action, that we feel is towards us. And we've chosen to see that as something that is personal towards us. And that emotional reaction, or that emotional charge that brings, the anger or the frustration or the disappointment or all of those, that's what's completely normal within the human experience, is to have things that are going to trigger us. And we as humans then have a choice in that situation. Are we going to, with an awareness that we're emotionally triggered, are we going to take that trigger, and are we going to act upon it in a way that's going to project then our frustration, our anger, our whatever, because that's what we're feeling? And so this is the back and forth. They call this the dance, right? This is in every relationship. You can call it your boss in you, your coworker in you, your husband in you, your wife in you, your kids in you. Every relationship has this dance, right? Of things that we're taking personally and things that we feel like we feel justified sometimes then in projecting that emotion that we're feeling then back on the other individual. And this is how it goes back and forth, back and forth. And so in episode 27, Catherine and I say, pause, hold on a second. Let's talk about that. What is that? Where can we actually take a moment, pause that out, and really recognize that if we're then reacting and we're engaging from a place of emotion because of that frustration, because of that anger, and we are justifying that, there's like this justification of, yes, I feel like it's okay for me to express this anger, for me to express this hurt, this frustration. What we're doing is we are acknowledging our participation in the dance, and we're saying, yep, I agree that that is a part of the dance, and I agree into participating in the dance. And what Catherine and I really were wanting to do in that episode is say, let's pause for just 1 second, and let's talk just a moment about whether or not we want to engage in the dance. I'm pausing because I think that so often it's the ego that truly believes in the moment that we need to go all in, right? Now that we've got our own emotions that we feel justified in not only feeling and expressing, right? When that then comes back upon us, right? We get whatever we get back from them. It's not going to be great. I can tell you that right now. It's not going to be great. But whatever that ends up coming back, then that just perpetuates it on itself. So if at the end of the day, and this is how I work with clients, this is how I work with other leaders I work with, at the end of the day, if there's an awareness that you're a participant in the dance and not really an awareness of wanting to actually pause before we get to a point where it may be creating additional toxicity in any way, now I think we're talking in terms of whether or not this is something that we want to change. And that's the tough love that Catherine and I delivered in episode 27. And ultimately, the tough love I feel like I'm having to deliver with myself occasionally, especially when I get caught up in this, this type of back and forth dance with my son or my husband. And after the fact, I'm like, why? What was that? Like, what did that serve at the end of the day? And how ultimately is that showing up as my best self? And so these are the opportunities that we can start to become more aware and start to ask and start to question and become curious. And it doesn't need to be something that we beat ourselves up for in any way. And that's, I think, the tricky part is most of the time when we become aware of our own part in whatever toxicity and unhealthy components are contributing to the perpetuation of the situation, that awareness it doesn't feel good. That awareness actually is like, oh yeah, I'm a part of the problem. And not just a part of the problem, you are the solution. And so when we have to own that awareness, it's not going to feel great. It might sting. But Catherine and I, at the end of the episode, really came back around and said, hey, you're not alone. You are absolutely not alone. We're in this together. I just had something happen yesterday. And I think in the episode that was true at the time too. And so what we're here to be able to do with this podcast and what I'm here to do for you is really to help you see that awareness is just the first step. Now, once you put that self-judgment, that self-criticism, that self-blame, whatever it is aside, and go through episode 2 of forgiveness, now you can really start to build the you that you want to be the next time something like this happens, right? And that's where the work comes in. So in getting back to the next episode that I felt like was so important for Catherine and I, and another episode that we're going to be visiting very soon in a future episode, was episode number 20. Episode number 20 was No More Us Versus Them, how HR can build bridges that work. So we all know nobody is a stranger to how much of a divide there is in our world today, how much of a divide there is in our organizations, how much us versus them, employees and leadership, or this department and that department, or vendors versus customers, or I could go on and on and on, right? The us versus them dichotomy and dynamic has been there for ages, and it's not going anywhere. And as HR professionals, I think that is one of our greatest superpowers, is to be able to step outside and to truly be able to recognize the us versus them and what it really is, and really be able to start to kind of wade through. And in this episode was so much about patience, because it can be so tempting. I know for me, with my ADHD brain, it can be so tempting to just want to say, hey, you come here, okay? Let's talk about this. Let's really recognize we all want the same things. We want harmony. We want peace. We want truth. I think so often I'm just like that way, right? But then you look at politics and you're like, but do we want peace? It starts to get confusing as you start to pull out. And so as HR professionals, so often I think it's really hard to kind of see these dichotomies, to see these us and them, and good and bad and right and wrong. And it can be overwhelming. It can be so overwhelming, because ultimately some of these things run so deep. They run so deep that where do you start, right? How do you even begin? And so that's where in this episode we talk about, just get curious today. Just get curious with what's right in front of you. Just take those opportunities first to check in with yourself. Where's my ego in all of this, right? And then lean in and try to understand. Because at the end of the day, we're just a lot of people, and there's a lot of confusion out there. There's no doubt in my mind about it, whether it's this thing, that thing, this, whatever. There's a lot of misunderstanding. There's misguidedness, there's misdirection. But I truly believe, and here's where, I was just talking about this the other day with a client, where I had said that there is nothing that will ever push me away from my deep and strong belief in humanity, right? In our essence of humanity towards and with one another. And my role, I think my purpose on this planet, I think, is to try to really do everything I can in this moment, in the next moment, to be my best, and to try to recognize that we're not all going to agree. We're not going to have the same perspectives, but I can respect your perspectives. I can have the awareness of the perspectives that are not necessarily aligned with mine, but I understand them. And that's, I think, something that as HR professionals, it's one of the gifts that, again, I think is one of our greatest superpowers. So episode 12, please episode 20 is the us versus them. Please take a listen to it. I think you'll really enjoy it. It's just an amazing conversation between she and I. We have stories that we tell that really talk about how far we've come in terms of our own awareness and how we also got caught up in that us versus them, and then also how far we have to go and how overwhelming and how stressful and how easily that can feel hard, in our roles, and how can we step outside of that and not take it personally and to go back and to not take it personally. Oh man, we have come quite a ways, and it's so funny. I had so many different episodes I highlighted that I wanted to talk about today that I didn't get a chance to, because there have been episodes that have been really difficult as well as really beautiful in terms of things that they have brought to my awareness. And one of those episodes was around how to deal with difficult employees. And I think, it's so hard because in our HR roles, we are not in control many times of the decision of whether to keep or whether to let go of someone who we see very clearly is toxic and difficult and is really bringing down the culture and the environment. And what do you do with that? How do you work with that? And from my experience, and something that we talked about in episode 8, it's really about just continuing to show up as my best, walking my walk, and knowing that I may not have control over the outcome of this individual continuing to do as they do amongst the employees in the organization. But I am going to make sure that I do my best to shine a light, not only on myself, that I'm keeping myself in check of who I am and what I represent, regardless of who they are and what they represent. I'm not going to get myself sucked into that, right? And that I'm going to make sure that regardless of what's happened in the past, that I can do my best to be clear and without resentments and judgments in the moment, that ultimately whatever choices I have around what's brought us here today, that I'm going to do my best to represent both employees and the organization in the way that I know how, with a loving heart, an open heart. And as the behavior continues, which it probably will with people who are difficult, right? If there are deep things that are not being addressed, they'll perpetuate. That's where patience comes in, right? That's where the patience of just sitting with it, bearing with it, and taking the time that it will work itself out. And as that happens, and as the light then can be shined on them again, ultimately you can continue to recognize that it will work itself out. Just don't lose that light within yourself, and don't stop calling out what's right and what's just and what's fair, regardless of whether or not the opinions and judgments of those who are in control of those individuals, whether they stay or that they go, is within your control. So, okay, well, with that, I just want to say thank you so much for 50 episodes. Thank you for everything that you've given my life over the course of time, where I've been able to talk through things not only that have been challenging in my own past, but also things that have challenged me in the present, and being able to have this platform that has been a game changer for me. So just like I think Catherine and I really envisioned with this podcast, the interviewing aspect that she and I have so loved and admired is coming back. I now have a few appointments scheduled of those brave souls who want to come on and have an interview with Thrive and Shine HR and talk about their own story and how they believe that their story can help inspire HR professionals out there. And so I'm excited excited for that. That's coming up here in the next few weeks. March's theme for Thrive and Shine HR is all about our thoughts and emotions. So what better way to kick it off than this episode with episode 50, and recognizing that even with the 50 episodes that we've had, my thoughts and emotions are just as human as yours. And I've had my high moments and I've had my low moments, and I've had to really recognize that having a platform like this, having a podcast, having a live cast, having everywhere that I am putting myself out there is scary AF, right? It is not the most comfortable thing getting on here and putting this out there every week. And yet, I know it's where I'm supposed to be. I know it's what I'm supposed to be doing. And that gives me a lot of peace. Even if the tech failed again today, which it did, the video wasn't quite working today, which it wasn't, the sound got a little goofy, so I'm even hoping that you were able to hear this today. I'm not sure. I just went ahead and recorded anyway. And I'm here, and I'm showing up, and I'm talking about something that matters deeply to me. And so that, I believe, is really what thoughts and emotions, what it's all about, is like, how can we pull ourselves out of all of the constant thinking we do, the thousands and thousands of thoughts that we have each day, recognize the emotional pull, the ego's pull to want to get caught up into not feeling good enough, not feeling seen, not this, not that, all of this turmoil that we create within ourselves, right? And that's really, I think, what this podcast is about, and where I'm so excited for episode 51. So in a couple weeks is when we'll record episode 51, 2 weeks from today, 7 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Eastern, just like today on Sunday. And we are going to be talking about thoughts and emotions. We're going to have a guest. I haven't yet broadcast the name because we are still in the process of recording, so hopefully that goes well. And then I am going to plug the name because it will be exciting to have that interview where we're going to talk about how we get caught up in our own head and what to do about it, actionable steps we can take to really step up in our lives in 25, because I want to see us all thrive, right? It's like, thrive in 25. That was so corny. It sounded so good in my head, and then it got so corny as soon as it started to come out. So sorry about that. So, all right, with that, a couple of just housekeeping notes. Again, I am so excited for our sponsor, Thrive 360, for the podcast name Thrive and Shine HR. To have a sponsor called Thrive 360 is really exciting. And to have a sponsor that works with organizations, that works with HR professionals, that really gets in there and creates tailored and custom wellness programs for your employees, that's something I can get behind. So I am so excited for our sponsor. Thank you so much, Christy and Thrive 360, for giving me the opportunity to be able to talk about how amazing you are. And if you want to learn more about Thrive 360, I'll put a link in the notes for today's episode. So with that, I want to bid you farewell. Thank you so much for joining me today. And don't forget, everybody, every single day is a brand new day to thrive and shine in HR. Bye, everybody. We'll see you next time.